I climbed into the water tower to escape the cold. A widow said, "You picked the wrong night to hide here." Dean Sorrell had $8, a duffel bag with a set of hand tools he'd carried since his last steady job on a municipal water maintenance crew, and a habit of checking any elevated water tank he passed for a way inside, a habit that had led him, more than once that year, to exactly the kind of shelter that kept him out of weather too harsh to sleep through outdoors. He was 23 years old, laid off 7 months earlier when the small municipal utility that employed him contracted its remaining maintenance work to a private firm operating out of the county seat, eliminating every locally based position in the process. He had been moving through farm country ever since, taking whatever short-term work he could find. The contracting notice had used language about cost efficiency and streamlined service delivery, phrases Dean had come to recognize across 7 months of towns exactly like this one, as the specific municipal dialect for deciding that a local worker's actual familiarity with the town's water infrastructure mattered less than whatever a distant firm could theoretically manage on a rotating schedule instead. He had grown up around municipal water systems his whole life, his mother having worked as a utility clerk for 2 decades before retiring. And though his own path into maintenance work had come through his own effort rather than any family trade exactly, he had inherited from her a particular respect for the quiet, unglamorous systems that kept ordinary life running without anyone much noticing until they failed. The cold snap that arrived that particular evening dropped temperatures well below anything the forecast had predicted, and Dean, caught on foot along a rural county road with no town in sight, spotted the old water tower rising above a modest farmstead and made for it with the specific urgency of a man who understood exactly how dangerous a night this cold could become for someone caught outdoors without shelter. He climbed the tower's exterior ladder, his hands already stiffening in the cold despite his gloves, and worked the access hatch open with fingers that fumbled twice before finding the proper release. He found, inside the tank's small maintenance platform beneath the water chamber itself, a space just large enough to escape the worst of the wind, and a woman already there, wrapped in a heavy coat, a lantern turned low beside her. "You picked the wrong night to hide here," the woman said, her voice tight with a fear that had nothing to do with Dean's sudden appearance, though she studied him with evident wariness regardless. "I'd tell you to find somewhere else, except I don't think there's anywhere else within walking distance in this cold, and I don't have it in me to send a stranger back out into it." "I didn't mean to intrude," Dean said. "I saw the tower and needed somewhere out of the wind. I'll go, if you'd rather, once I've warmed up enough to manage it." "It's not you I'm worried about," the woman said. "Name's Ruth Ashford. This tower's on my late husband's farm. I climbed up here tonight because a man's coming to the house this evening that I'd rather not be alone to face, and this seemed like the one place on this property he wouldn't think to look for me." "What kind of man?" Dean asked. "The kind my husband owed money to," Ruth said, "before a farm accident took him 8 months ago and left me to answer for a debt I didn't know the full size of until after his funeral." She studied Dean a long moment, the lantern light catching the exhaustion in her face. "You've picked a strange night to need shelter, stranger. I hope you're not regretting it already." "I don't regret it yet," Dean said, "though I'll admit I hadn't planned on tonight involving anything more complicated than staying warm." He glanced around the cramped platform, taking in the lantern, the folded blanket Ruth had clearly brought up for herself, the particular preparation of someone who had planned this hiding place carefully rather than fled to it in sudden panic. "You've thought this through before tonight, haven't you? This isn't the first time you've come up here." "It's become something of a habit these past months," Ruth admitted. "Whenever his visits feel particularly likely, I climb up here rather than wait for him at the house. I don't know that it's solved anything exactly. It's simply given me somewhere to be that isn't directly in his path." Over the following hour, huddled together against the cold on the tower's small platform, Ruth told Dean, in a voice that stayed low even though there was no one nearby to overhear them, exactly why she was hiding from a man expected at her own farmhouse that very evening. Her husband, Daniel, had borrowed money from a local lender named Marcus Cade 2 years before his death, a private loan meant to cover a difficult season's expenses and keep the farm solvent until the following harvest, at terms Daniel had apparently agreed to, without fully understanding how aggressively the interest would compound if any payment ever fell behind schedule. Daniel's death 8 months earlier, from an accident with farm equipment that had nothing to do with the debt itself, had left Ruth managing a loan balance that had, through Cade's own calculations, ballooned to nearly 4 times its original principal, an amount Ruth had no realistic way of paying without losing the farm entirely. "Daniel never wanted to worry me with it," Ruth said. "I found out how bad it actually was only after the funeral, when Cade showed up at the house with a folder of paperwork and a very particular kind of patience, the sort that makes clear a man's in no hurry because he already believes time is working entirely in his favor. I've spent 8 months trying to negotiate with him myself, making small payments I can barely afford, and the balance never seems to actually shrink no matter what I send him." "That sounds less like a repayment schedule and more like a trap," Dean said. "That's precisely what it started to feel like," Ruth said. "Every payment I make apparently just covers interest that's accrued since the last one, and the principal itself never moves. I don't understand the arithmetic of it well enough to know whether that's simply how loans work, or whether something about this particular one isn't right." "He's coming tonight because he knows my neighbor, who usually checks on me most evenings, is away visiting her daughter for the week," Ruth said. "I don't think that's a coincidence, him choosing tonight specifically. I think he wants me alone and frightened enough to sign whatever papers he brings, rather than facing him with anyone else present who might ask the kind of questions I've been too afraid to ask myself." "How does he know your neighbor's schedule that precisely?" Dean asked. "This is farm country," Ruth said. "Everyone knows everyone's comings and goings, whether they mean to share that information or not. I don't think Cade needed to work particularly hard to learn when I'd be most alone. He's simply patient, and patient men in his line of work tend to notice these things eventually." "Have you had anyone review the original loan terms?" Dean asked. "An attorney? Anyone at all?" "I don't have money for an attorney," Ruth said. "That's rather the whole problem, isn't it? I've been managing this alone since Daniel died, and Marcus Cade knows precisely how alone that actually is." Dean spent the remainder of that first hour doing the only thing that felt useful under the circumstances, helping Ruth think through what she actually knew about the loan and what she didn't, understanding that whatever happened once Cade arrived would go considerably better if Ruth wasn't facing it with nothing more than fear and an unclear grasp of the numbers involved. "Do you have the original loan documents?" Dean asked. "Whatever Daniel actually signed, rather than just Cade's own account of what's owed?" "Somewhere in the house," Ruth said. "I've been too afraid to look through Daniel's papers properly. Every time I start, I end up simply crying instead of actually reading anything." "That's not a failure on your part," Dean said. 8 months isn't very long to grieve a husband, whatever a debt collector's timeline might demand of you regardless." "It feels like a failure some mornings," Ruth admitted. "Like I should have sorted through all of this by now, understood the numbers, had some kind of plan beyond simply being afraid every time his truck comes up the drive." "I don't think grief works on anybody's convenient schedule," Dean said. "Least of all a schedule set by the same man who's benefiting from you staying too overwhelmed to look closely at what he's actually claiming. Grief and fear make a particularly effective trap when somebody else is counting on both to keep you from looking too carefully at your own situation." "We've got time before Cade arrives," Dean said. "I'd rather spend it looking at the actual paperwork than simply waiting up here hoping the numbers are less bad than you fear." They climbed down from the tower together, the cold having eased slightly as the night wore on, and made their way to the farmhouse, where Ruth retrieved a small strong box from a closet shelf she'd avoided opening since the funeral. Inside, alongside Daniel's other papers, was the original loan agreement itself, its terms laid out in dense, unfamiliar legal language that neither Ruth nor, evidently, Daniel himself had fully understood at the time of signing. Dean spread the document across the kitchen table, along with a pad of paper he found near the phone, and began working through the numbers methodically. The same patient approach he'd once used checking meter readings against billing statements during his years on the municipal crew. Ruth sat across from him, watching with the particular anxious hope of someone who'd been too afraid to look this closely at her own situation for months. Dean read through the document carefully, cross-referencing the stated interest rate against a number he vaguely remembered from a financial literacy course his own mother had insisted he take years earlier, working the calculation twice to be certain nerves alone hadn't led him to an error, and found, doing rough arithmetic on the back of an old envelope, that the loan's actual annualized interest rate, once properly calculated including the various fees Cade had layered into the agreement, exceeded the state's legal usury limit by a considerable margin. "This rate isn't just steep," Dean said. "I think it's illegal. If I'm doing this math correctly, Cade's charging you an effective rate well beyond what state law actually permits for a private loan like this one. That doesn't just mean the balance he's claiming is inflated. It might mean the whole agreement is unenforceable as written. I don't know enough about the law to trust my own reading of that," Ruth said. "And I don't have time to find someone who does before he arrives tonight." "Then we call someone who can confirm it quickly," Dean said, already reaching for the farmhouse's old landline phone. Even a preliminary opinion tonight might be enough to change how this conversation with Cade actually goes. Dean's own mother, it turned out, had once worked as a legal secretary for a rural attorney 2 counties over, and though Dean hadn't spoken to her in months, he called her without hesitation, understanding the situation left little room for pride about a strained relationship he'd have preferred to mend under better circumstances. His mother answered on the 3rd ring, her voice carrying the particular surprised caution of someone unused to hearing from a son who'd drifted, over the past year, into calling less and less often. "Dean," she said, "it's nearly 11. Is everything all right?" "I need help," Dean said plainly. "For someone else, not for me. I'm sorry to call so late, and I'm sorry it's been so long since the last time. I promise we'll talk properly soon. Right now, I need the number for that attorney you used to work for, if you still have it." Something in his voice must have conveyed the genuine urgency, because his mother didn't press further, simply retrieving the number from an old address book she still kept, and reading it out to him without a single question about why he needed it at that hour. His mother, once she understood what was actually happening, gave him the emergency number for her former employer, an attorney named Foster Cray, who, despite the late hour, agreed to review a photograph of the loan document Dean sent him from Ruth's own phone and called back within the half hour with a preliminary but confident assessment. "This rate is well above the state's usury cap," Cray told them, his voice crackling faintly over the speaker Dean held between them. "I can't give you a fully binding legal opinion this quickly, but I'm confident enough in what I'm seeing to tell you plainly that Mr. Cade has considerably less legal standing than he's likely led Mrs. Ashford to believe. I'd suggest you inform him, when he arrives, that you're aware of this issue and intend to have it formally reviewed, rather than signing anything he brings tonight." "How confident are you in that assessment?" Ruth asked, her voice tight with the particular need for certainty that comes right before a confrontation nobody wants to face unprepared. "Confident enough that I'd stake my own reputation on it holding up under formal review," Cray said. "I've seen this exact pattern of layered fees disguising a genuine usury violation more than once in this county. Mr. Cade is not, I suspect, the first predatory lender to try this particular arithmetic on someone he assumed wouldn't check it properly. The hour that followed Cray's call passed slowly, Ruth pacing the small kitchen while Dean reviewed the loan document once more, checking his own arithmetic a second and third time to be certain he hadn't made an error that might cost Ruth her nerve at exactly the wrong moment. Ruth made coffee neither of them drank, straightened the same stack of mail twice, and finally sat down across from Dean with the particular stillness of someone forcing calm onto a body that badly wanted to keep moving. "I keep thinking about what happens if he doesn't listen," Ruth said. "If he simply doesn't care what an attorney says over the phone and pushes ahead regardless." "Then we call the sheriff, and we let this become exactly the kind of documented incident that makes a formal complaint considerably stronger," Dean said. "I don't think a man like Cade wants that kind of attention, whatever confidence he's built his whole business on projecting. Men like him rely on quiet intimidation, working precisely because most people never test whether it would survive actually being challenged in public." Headlights swept across the kitchen window not long after, and Ruth's breath caught audibly, her hand finding the edge of the table as though she needed something solid to hold on to before the confrontation actually began. Marcus Cade arrived at the farmhouse just before 10 that evening, a heavy-set man with the particular practiced menace of someone accustomed to intimidation, working more reliably than actual legal authority, accompanied by a second man who said nothing throughout the entire visit, but stood close enough to make his purpose plain. His truck's headlights swept across the farmhouse windows well before he reached the door, giving Ruth and Dean a full minute of warning that did little to steady either of their nerves. "Mrs. Ashford," Cade said, stepping into the farmhouse's front room without waiting to be invited. "I trust you've had time to consider the paperwork I left with you last visit. I'd like this settled tonight, one way or another." His eyes moved to Dean, cataloging him with the particular assessment of a man used to identifying threats quickly. "I wasn't told you'd have company." "I've had considerably more than time to consider it," Ruth said with a steadiness Dean hadn't heard in her voice before that moment, though he could see her hands trembling slightly where they gripped the back of a kitchen chair. "I've had it reviewed by an attorney, who confirms the interest rate on this loan exceeds the state's legal limit by a significant margin. I don't intend to sign anything further until that issue is properly resolved." Cade's practiced menace flickered, just slightly, replaced by something more calculating. "I don't know what attorney told you that," he said, "but I'd remind you that a signed agreement is a signed agreement, whatever rate you believe it carries. Contracts don't unwind themselves simply because somebody's decided after the fact that they don't care for the terms they agreed to. A signed agreement that violates state usury law isn't enforceable as written," Dean said, stepping forward from where he'd been standing near the hallway. "I'd think you already know that, Mr. Cade, which is rather why you've been counting on Mrs. Ashford facing this alone tonight rather than with anyone who might actually know to check." Cade studied Dean a long moment, recalculating something behind his composed expression. "And who exactly are you?" he asked. "Someone who happened to be here tonight," Dean said, "and someone who's already spoken with an attorney willing to formally review this agreement first thing tomorrow morning, regardless of whatever you and Mrs. Ashford decide between yourselves tonight." Cade's silent companion shifted his weight, and for a moment the room's tension sharpened considerably, both Ruth and Dean watching the larger man's hands carefully, before Cade himself, evidently deciding the risk of an actual confrontation with witnesses and a documented legal complaint wasn't worth whatever satisfaction tonight's visit might have otherwise provided, stepped back toward the door. "I'd think carefully before threatening a course of action you're not prepared to actually follow through on properly," Dean added, holding his ground even as the larger man's presence filled the small room considerably. "An attorney's already aware of tonight's visit, Mr. Cade. Whatever happens in this house from this point forward becomes part of a record he's already building. I'll expect to hear from your attorney then, Cade said, rather than continuing to waste an evening on a conversation that apparently isn't going to resolve tonight regardless. His eyes lingered on Ruth a moment longer, something calculating still working behind his composed retreat. This isn't finished, Mrs. Ashford. Legal review or not, I intend to see this debt properly resolved one way or another. Then you'll see it resolved according to the law? Ruth said, not according to whatever timeline made you think tonight, of all nights, was the right one to arrive uninvited and alone. He left without further argument, his companion following silently behind him, and Ruth sat down heavily at her own kitchen table once the sound of his truck had faded down the county road, her hands shaking with the particular delayed reaction of someone who had held herself together through genuine danger, and only now felt safe enough to let the fear catch up with her properly. Dean sat across from her, saying nothing for a while, simply letting her have the space to shake without commentary, until Ruth finally spoke again, her voice unsteady but clearer than it had been all evening. I've been so frightened of that man for 8 months, she said. I don't think I understood until just now how much of that fear was simply the fear of facing him without knowing whether I actually had any ground to stand on. Knowing the numbers, having somebody confirm what I suspected but couldn't prove myself, that's changed something tonight. I don't think I can fully explain yet. You don't have to explain it tonight, Dean said. You held your ground the moment it mattered most. That's not nothing, whatever numbers turned out to back it up. I don't think I'd have held it alone, Ruth admitted. I want to be honest about that. Whatever it says about me, I don't think anybody holds ground entirely alone, Dean said. I think that's rather the whole point of somebody happening to be there when it matters. Foster Cray's formal review, completed within the following week, confirmed the loan's interest rate exceeded state usury limits considerably, voiding the inflated balance Cade had been demanding and reducing Ruth's actual remaining obligation to a figure closer to the original principal, an amount she could realistically manage to pay down over time without losing the farm entirely. I don't know how to properly thank you for tonight, Ruth told Dean, once the immediate crisis had passed and Cray's review had confirmed everything Dean's own rough arithmetic had suggested. I don't think I'd have found the courage to face him at all if you hadn't been sitting beside me reminding me the numbers actually mattered more than his own confidence in claiming them. I think you'd have found the courage regardless, Dean said. I just happened to be there to help you find the numbers a little faster than you might have managed alone. Maybe, Ruth said. But I don't think I'll ever be entirely certain of that, and I don't think I need to be. What I know for certain is that you were there, and that mattered enough tonight that I don't much care to imagine the alternative. Cade did not return to the farm again, and word of his usurious lending practices, once Cray's formal complaint reached the state's Consumer Protection Office, prompted a broader investigation that uncovered similar predatory loans against 3 other struggling farm families in the same county. Each of them ultimately granted the same relief Ruth had received once the pattern became too well documented to ignore. The investigation took the better part of 4 months, during which a state examiner named Priscilla Hart visited Ruth twice to review her own loan documents in detail, cross-referencing them against similar complaints that had begun surfacing once the local paper ran a short article about the usury findings. Hart's second visit brought considerably more detail than the first, describing to Ruth the specific pattern her office had uncovered, Cade routinely offering loans to farm families during difficult seasons, when desperation made careful scrutiny of loan terms considerably less likely, then relying on aggressive collection tactics and the general assumption that a signed agreement was simply binding regardless of its actual legality. You weren't the first family Cade did this to, Hart told Ruth during her second visit. But you may well be the reason he doesn't get the chance to do it to anyone else. Once one family has the confidence to push back properly, documented and formal, it makes it considerably easier for the next family to do the same. What happens to the other families now? Ruth asked. Each of them will have their own loans reviewed under the same standard that applied to yours. Hart said, I expect most of them will see similar relief once the usury violations are properly documented. I wanted you to know that directly, Mrs. Ashford, rather than simply reading about it eventually in the paper. Your case is the reason this investigation happened at all. Cade's lending license, issued years earlier by the county and rarely scrutinized since, was formally revoked that following spring, and the state's Consumer Protection Office used the case, according to a follow-up article in the regional paper, as a template for reviewing similar private lending arrangements across 3 neighboring counties. A legacy Ruth found herself feeling a complicated mixture of relief and lingering anger about, having wished the reckoning had come considerably sooner, before her own husband's death had left her facing it so unprepared. I keep thinking about the other 3 families, Ruth told Dean one evening that spring, reading through the follow-up article together at the kitchen table. I wonder how many of them spent months afraid the way I was, not knowing there was actually a law protecting them the whole time. I imagine most of them didn't know, Dean said. That's rather how a man like Cade counts on getting away with it as long as he did. Fear works considerably better on people who don't know they have any grounds to stand on. Dean stayed on at the farm through that winter and the ones that followed, the water tower that had first given him an evening's shelter from the cold becoming, over time, something closer to a private joke between the 2 of them, a place they returned to more than once, simply to remember the strange, frightening night that had brought them together in the first place. He took on the farm's own maintenance needs as his contribution to the household, understanding the particular mechanical systems a working farm depended on well enough from his own municipal background to keep pumps and pipes and the water tower's own aging valve running considerably more reliably than they'd been maintained since Daniel's death. Ruth, in turn, taught him the actual rhythm of the farm itself, the planting schedules and the livestock's particular needs, work he found himself surprised to enjoy considerably more than he'd expected, given how little farming had featured in his own life before that cold night's chance arrival. He learned, over that first full year, the specific satisfaction of watching a season through from planting to harvest, a rhythm considerably different from the maintenance work he'd known before, where a job finished cleanly and moved on to the next, rather than unfolding slowly across months of patient attention. Ruth taught him to read weather the way farmers had for generations before either weather service existed, and he found himself, by that first autumn, checking the sky each morning with an instinct he hadn't possessed the previous winter, a small but genuine transformation he attributed entirely to a woman patient enough to teach a stranger her whole way of life, without ever once making him feel behind for not already knowing it. He called his mother regularly after that, the strained silence of the previous year finally broken by the urgency of that one late-night call. And she visited the farm herself the following spring, meeting Ruth properly for the first time and telling Dean afterward, with evident satisfaction, that she approved of exactly the kind of steady, capable woman her son had apparently stumbled into a life with. You really did pick the wrong night to hide up there, Ruth told him one evening the following winter, the 2 of them sharing a thermos of coffee on the tower's small platform, out of a habit that had become, by then, considerably more sentimental than practical. Wrong for hiding from the cold, exactly right for everything that came after. I don't think I've ever been more grateful for bad timing in my life, Dean said. Ruth thought, some evenings, about the 8 months of fear that had preceded that particular cold night. The quiet terror of managing a threat she hadn't fully understood, alone and understood, watching Dean check the tower's valve with the same patient attention he brought to everything on the farm now, that she had finally found the thing those 8 months of isolation had never once offered her. Not simply help with a debt, but a steady, permanent presence who had proven, on the one, night it mattered most, that she would never again have to face genuine danger entirely by herself. She kept the original loan document, its usurious terms now formally voided, framed in the same strongbox where she'd once been too afraid to look, alongside the state's formal ruling and a copy of the newspaper article describing Cade's revoked license, a small private record of exactly how close she'd come to losing everything and exactly what had actually stood between her and that loss on the one night it mattered. Dean thought in turn about the 7 months of towns and contracting notices that had led him to a water tower on a cold rural road, and understood, watching Ruth move through her own farmhouse with a confidence that had barely existed the night they'd met, that he had found, at the end of that unsettled stretch, exactly the kind of purpose his own mother had quietly modeled for him through decades of steady, unglamorous municipal work. Not simply a job, but a reason to show up for somebody who genuinely needed him to. So here's the question worth sitting with tonight. How many people facing genuine danger convince themselves they have to face it entirely alone, simply because asking for help feels harder than enduring the fear by themselves? And what does it take? A cold night, a stranger climbing into the wrong shelter at exactly the right time, a debt finally measured honestly against the law, for someone facing real danger to finally not have to face it by herself. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Ember and Rail, because there's always room by the fire for one more, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight.